Good morning, everyone. Thank you for waking up early and joining us. It's a nice little crowd we have, and we'll make it very energetic. So I'm Justyna Gudzowska. I'm Director of Illicit Finance Policy at the Sentry, and we're going to have a great panel for you on how we can work together to counter kleptocracy with representatives from the private sector, public sector, from a financial institution, from the crypto industry, really how we can put the pieces together to counter this kleptocratic regimes all over the world. But before we get started, we have a very special guest to you, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from the great state of Rhode Island. For those of you who are from overseas, Rhode Island is known as the Ocean State. And it's a great pleasure to have him here today because he's really been a leading voice in Congress and in DC in the fight against kleptocracy and corruption, the issues near and dear to our heart. He's the chair of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control, a senior member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, chair of the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Taxation and IRS Oversight, and a member of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission. Yesterday, if you were at the plenary, you heard a lot of people talk about some landmark anti-money laundering legislation that has been passed by the US Congress or hopefully is on the verge of getting passed. Well, Senator Whitehouse is the force behind a lot of this legislation. He was a lead author of the groundbreaking Corporate Transparency Act passed in 2020 that required the US for the first time to set up a central beneficial ownership register. Yesterday also you heard National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talk about the Enablers Act. Senator Whitehouse introduced the Enablers Act. This is common sense legislation that would put some basic anti-money laundering obligations on non-financial businesses and professionals, financial gatekeepers such as lawyers, accountants, company service and trust that has been linked to specified illegal acts. So how do you go from freezing to seizing oligarch assets? Chairman Whitehouse recently led the Caucus on International Narcotics Control in issuing a bipartisan report on ways to strengthen the US anti-money laundering framework. So, as you can see, it makes great sense to have Senator Whitehouse speak to you because he's really a leader on many of the issues we're here discussing at the conference. So without further ado, Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the conference and to so many of the groups that participate in the conference for your support of my various efforts. It has put real wind under our sails, and we've had some conspicuous successes as a result. I would like to start this morning with my thesis. My thesis is that old Sam Huntington was right about a clash of civilizations, but he had the boundary of the clash a little wrong. To me, the boundary of the clash of civilizations is the boundary between rule of law on the one hand and kleptocracy, autocracy, corruption, and criminality, which is four ways of saying the same thing, on the other hand. And I think recent history shows that a great deal, if not all, of the evil that has befallen rule of law societies has emerged from the kleptocratic, autocratic, criminal, and corrupt societies who operate outside of proper rule of law. So if that's the case, and the Biden administration has recognized that this is a real national security problem, not just a question of, catching a cohort of criminals that engage in money laundering, but an actual national security problem, then we need to step up to it and face it as a real national security problem. And if we're going to do that, one of the things we have to do is to stop the rule of law folks who are aiding and abetting our enemies across that conflict, who are giving aid and comfort to those enemies. And that means transparency. That means shining the light of knowing who's who and making sure that people understand and are on record as to who their real clients are, and making sure in particular that law enforcement has access to that information. So that's my thesis. We're in a clash of civilizations. In that clash, the anti-rule of law forces are using rule of law vehicles primarily to protect their assets, but also to implement some of their schemes. And we on the rule of law side have people who are giving aid and comfort to those enemies, and we have to take it seriously and see it in those terms. So that's the thesis. Now let me tell you a little story. When we started working on incorporation transparency and giving FinCEN visibility into American shell corporations, the problem had become really acute. Nobody could deny it any longer. We were perhaps the worst hidey hole for mischief money anywhere in the world. And we knew there'd be a little bit of opposition, and so we started working through the opposition. The first level of opposition was the obvious level of opposition. It was Delaware and some of the other states that earn a lot of money off incorporation, and particularly the Secretary of State in Delaware. And what we were able to do is work with them and also form a coalition of attorneys general, including Delaware's, who look at this from a slightly different perspective and build the consensus that this, in fact, had to be fixed. And with that, I had hoped we'd have a pretty clear runway to getting this bill passed. Not so fast. The first group that showed up to oppose having FinCEN see into shell corporations was the United States Chamber of Commerce. The United States Chamber of Commerce tends to represent massive corporate behemoths. They very rarely take the side of a small business anywhere. They don't even know the small business exists. They're more or less in tow to the big corporations of America. So why would this be such a big issue for them? So we exchanged views in various forums, we had debates and all of that, and they were unable to produce a coherent argument for why they were opposing the bill. Basically, they threw word salad in disconnected fashions out and hoped that that would make sense. But if you were paying attention, you realized that was just word salad. And then we started working on their members, like banks, which actually supported this. And we were able to take the US Chamber of Commerce and turn their opposition to neutrality. And as soon as that happened, guess what? Somebody else popped up. Now the American Bar Association, the lawyers. And they came to oppose, and I had the same experience. I'd go places to debate and to argue the proposition, and they couldn't put a coherent argument together against it. And I began to work the inside, the anti-money laundering groups, the banking groups, the former prosecutors, the associations within the Bar Association who were a little bit shocked that the Bar Association had taken this position. And so after considerable effort, the American Bar Association then went from opposed to neutral. And then popped up the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Only by now, my Republican friends working with me on the bill had been through this enough that when the NFIB came back with the identical discredited arguments and had nothing to add, actually, I had that happy moment where after the cross-examination of the NFIB witnessed by my Republican colleagues, I just said, I don't need to add a word here. You have completely hammered this. And we went forward, and with a lot of bipartisan support, we got this into the NDAA. I tell you that story because even something as obvious as making sure that FinCEN has visibility into phony shell corporations in our country propped up that kind of opposition from big American lobby groups. And we're seeing it right now on enablers also. It makes no sense to have money laundering rules for banks, to have disclosure for shell corporations, but to let somebody run into a lawyer's office or a hedge fund and dodge all of that protection. So we are going to continue to push for enablers. Unfortunately, The bill that was released last night, the National Defense Authorization Act, did not include enablers. I think we need to work with the administration to make sure it's a true operating priority for them as opposed to just a priority. Because when the Democratic Speaker of the House writes a National Defense Authorization Act to be passed with only Democrat votes, which was the challenge that she faced as the Republicans walked away from everything, and we have a Democratic administration that says this is a priority, but it's not in the bill, then I think some questions need to be asked about how big a priority it really was. But we have not given up. There are other options before us, and we have another Congress ahead of us, and this actually is bipartisan, and so the work remains. And I will end where I began. We are, in fact, engaged in a clash of civilizations. There is, in fact, real national security impact from allowing our institutions of law to be the vehicles through which kleptocrats, autocrats, criminals, and corrupt individuals hide and propagate their mischief. And we have to get after these people in the same way that in a regular traditional shooting war, you'd get after people who are giving aid and comfort to the adversary. And it's that kind of attention that I think this issue needs, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that it gets it. And I thank you for your terrific work to shine the light into these dark corners that needs to be shown. When you click on the light in the kitchen, the cockroaches scurry.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was inspiring. Thank you so much. And I think this is a great intro into our panel today, which I hope can be as conversant as possible. We want to have a discussion among one another. So I'm the director of illicit finance policy at a small nonprofit called the Sentry. And the goal of the Sentry is really to separate the kleptocrats from their ill-gotten gains. And how do we do that? We do that by following the money linked to kleptocrats and atrocities and publishing hard-hitting investigations and then going to the governments, going to the private sector, and getting them to do something. We all know here that kleptocrats use different methods to plunder their own countries and their own people, whether we're talking about Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs in Russia, the junta in Myanmar, or the corrupt government in South Sudan. They use different methods, from more traditional methods to move and store value, such as diamonds and gold, to traditional finance, banks, to newer methods, such as cryptocurrencies. So, as Senator Whitehouse put it, they also have a coterie of well-paid, gray suit wearing enablers willing to help them out for the right fee. These enablers work across jurisdictions, they work across professions, they work across areas of expertise. So to really counter them, we need to do the same thing, right? We need to work across jurisdictions, we need to work across professions, and we need to work across areas of expertise. Civil society folks can't sit in the bubble and just talk to other civil society folks. Private sector shouldn't do that. We need to burst those bubbles and talk to each other. And I think the most important thing to do this, and the thing that I really want to come out from this panel, is that we need trust. There is sometimes a lack of trust between the private sector and civil society, between government and civil society. You know, we like to point the fingers at each other and say, oh, you guys are the bad guy. No, you're just, you know, exposing us to get some clicks. That's not the case. There are great people working in the private sector, in civil society, in the government, all looking to do the right thing. So we need to build that trust. And this is really what this panel is about. And that's why we have folks from civil society, from the private sector, from a financial institution, and from the crypto industry to have this open and transparent discussion on what we can do better. So not to date any of these folks, but they all have decades of experience working on anti-corruption and anti-money laundering and fighting financial crime at different institutions. So they've really looked at the issue from different vantage points and can offer multiple perspectives. We have with us first Jane Khodarkovsky, who works, she's the general counsel of the Celo Foundation, where she helps the foundation and the Celo ecosystem achieve its mission of building conditions of prosperity and financial inclusion. I recently learned that her organization, Celo, won the Crypties for social impact, so using crypto for good, right? Not all of them are bad, despite what you may be reading in the papers right now. Prior to that, she was a prosecutor a trial attorney and human trafficking finance specialist with the U.S. Department of Justice. So she was in MLARS, the anti-money laundering unit of the Department of Justice, working on these issues from the law enforcement side. Next to her, we have my dear colleague, Denisse Rudich. She also works at the Sentry, but she's also the director of the G20 Research Group in London, associate fellow at RUSI, and has worked on countering financial crime in the public and private sector for 20 years. She's also our in-house crypto expert. Next to her, I have Liat Shetret. She's currently the Director of Global Policy and Regulation at Elliptic. But for 15 years, she has been working in this space. She was formerly at the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Unit, at Citigroup, at the Global Center on Cooperative Security, and at the U.S. House of Representatives Committee for Homeland Security. Next to her, I have Heather Epstein, who's currently at Barclays Bank. She's the America's head of sanctions and anti-bribery and corruption at Barclays. Prior to that, Heather spent a decade at the U.S. Department of Treasury advising on sanctions matters. She was also a federal prosecutor, a sex crimes prosecutor, and had worked at the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, right after the agency was set up after 9/11. And can I say, out of those 6, 5 women. Great, women in anti-corruption. So last but not least, we have Brad Brooks-Rubin, very lovely person. He's the senior advisor of the Office of Sanctions Coordination at the State Department. He works for Ambassador O'Brien, the sanctions coordinator. Prior to that, I had the pleasure of working with Brad. He was more than 6 years at the Sentry. He's also worked at the Responsible Jewelry Council, at the Gemological Institute of America. He was the State Department's lead on the Kimberley process. And way back when, he was also at the US Treasury Department working on sanctions. So we have a great people with vast experience. We will have a panel discussion. We'll leave time for questions. Please participate. In addition to being so impressive, everybody is very, very nice. So please ask your questions. Don't be shy. So I'll start off. I'll sit down and start with the first question. So Denisse, you've worked in anti-corruption for many years. Can you tell us about how laundering the proceeds of corruption has evolved?
Does this work? Yes? Okay, wonderful. So the other thing that Justyna did not mention is also I am a recovering banker, having worked in banking for over, I guess it was 15 years. And I still dabble in crypto and fintech and all of that wonderful things, those worlds. So the short answer is that we're seeing more automation, we're seeing more use of technology, but that's the short, boring answer. What I want to talk to you about is the Central African Republic. So, because I think it is a microcosm of how the laundering the proceeds of corruption has evolved over 5 years. Only 5 years. For those of you who don't know about the Central African Republic, it is quite possibly one of the most corrupt countries in the world. We are at a Transparency International conference, so I'll quote the CPI index, the Corruption Perceptions Index. It ranks 154 And it is the, I don't know, maybe the perfect example of state capture by the political elite, but it's also a proxy state of the Russian government. And it basically operates and provides a playground for corrupt politicians, organized crime networks, and mercenaries. In terms of the human costs of corruption and kleptocracy in the Central African Republic, it is atrocious. I was on a plane reading through the notes that I had taken, and I actually wanted to cry. We're talking about torture. We're talking about villages being cleared and entire communities being murdered, including women, children, the elderly. We're talking about ethnic cleansing. I think in Bambari there are allegations of possible war crimes. We're also talking about extrajudicial killings, torture, the worst kind of forms of torture that you can think about, and widespread and systemic. So when we're talking about systemic, it means it happens every day, it's accepted, it's known, it's not even hidden, of gender-based violence and rape. And there's also the child soldier recruitment that takes place. So, Central African Republic, we're talking about the laundering of proceeds of corruption. So I'm going to go back to 2018, when Russia arrived under the cooperative agreement. They were to provide 175 instructors to train the military. And this effectively opened the door for, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of the Wagner Group, which is a group of companies and mercenaries that are led by Putin's chef. I always butcher his name, Justyna Gudzowska. I don't know, anybody. We just know that it's Putin's chef. He's, Prigozhin. Thank you for the audience participation.
That's what we want.
That is what we want in this session. And basically this opened the door for the Wagner Group to increase their influence using bribery, intimidation, incredibly scary, aggressive propaganda that's also aimed at children. They used a lot of cartoons and kind of DC comic type cartoons and Marvel type comic cartoons. So again, they're targeting the future generations as well, and business. So again, enablers act very important. And in 2018, again, Wagner was given a lot of mining concessions. They gained exploration and exploitation licenses, particularly in gold and diamond mines. 2020, we know that there was an example of a Canadian company that had their license just taken away, and it was given to a Russian-owned company to allow them to mine for 25 years. I'm not sure if I can't gold or diamonds. Brad, you probably know this a little bit better than I do. And what happens around these mines is where a lot of the atrocities take place as well. We know that some of the mines and diamonds have also been purchased using US dollars, $100 bills, which means that, again, touch points into the United States, touch points into the United States banking system at some point in time in the chain. And armed groups are not only involved in providing security for the mines, but they're also kind of contributing to the expansion of human gold trafficking and the trafficking of diamonds. So once that gold gets taken out of the mines in car, it tends to go to Cameroon, to Chad, to Sudan, and then ultimately ends up in Dubai, where 95% of gold from East and Central Africa tends to end up. So that is what I call more of the traditional money laundering using cash and assets and commodities. April 2022. I remember reading, I was on my phone and I looked at it, I was like, what is this? The government of the Central African Republic unanimously voted to accept Bitcoin as the second official currency of the Central African Republic. At the time, Russia had already invaded Ukraine. I believe, Liat, am I correct, was the start of the crypto winter? Maybe not to the extent that it is right now, but it was the start of the crypto winter. Yeah. Now it is the Ice Age, yeah. And it made absolutely no logical or economic sense as to why they did that. So to me, I call that the rise of kleptocrypto, and I'm going to thank Justyna for coming up with the term, coining the term kleptocrypto. And we define that as the use of crypto assets and blockchain technology to effectively prop up and enrich dictatorships, corrupt network, and organized transnational networks. What was also absolutely fascinating about this decision is that only 10% of people in the Central African Republic have access to the internet. And I believe the latest statistic was that about 0% have access to broadband. And if anybody here in this room has tried to, I know that I'm sitting next to two people who maybe regularly do, tries to process a transaction on the blockchain, having broadband, you're looking at like, it takes hours, or it can take hours, depending on what chain you're using and the speed of your internet provider. So the fact that this was launched was, to me, incredible, extraordinary, and shocking. So that was in April. Then we moved to July, and again, looked at my phone, reading the news, and I'm like, oh my God, what is this? I remember texting Justyna and being like, so the Central African Republic decided to launch the Sango project, which effectively promises to create a crypto oasis in the heart of Africa. For a £500 investment in Bitcoin, you can buy e-residency, you can buy land on the Bangui River and in the metaverse. You can buy citizenship, which, you know, interesting. But what really struck me was the fact that you can buy mining rights as well with the coin that's being created out of it, which is the Sango coin. And I will not bore you with the technicalities. I will stick to my lane. The Central African Republic estimated that within 1 week they would make $21 million, which maybe last year that could have happened. I don't think that is what has happened. And at some point in time, I'm going to tap up Liat and say, Liat, how much money has actually moved into CAR on the blockchain? Because that's what her firm does. We cannot say for sure that this is a Russian-backed project because we haven't been able to obtain that as evidence. But we do know that it was seen as a way of allowing the Central African Republic to become independent from French monetary union, but also to evade any kind of banking controls. And I like banking. I'm again, recovering banking. I like banking controls. I like seeing where the money goes. The other kind of last little bit of information is that this was deemed to be unconstitutional by the president of the Constitutional Court of the Central African Republic. In October, he was removed from post. So again, you can see the corruption, like the blatant corruption taking place. CAR is not the only country that uses klepto crypto. Maybe many of you may have heard of the Venezuelan Petro. In Iran, they've evaded sanctions using the proceeds of mining, so crypto mining, to pay for goods. North Korea regularly funds their nuclear weapons program from cryptocurrencies that they get from the hacks. And El Salvador was the first country to make Bitcoin its official currency, and it is increasingly becoming an authoritarian regime. And I would be remiss not to mention Myanmar, because that's one of the countries we're working on. And the junta announced that they would be looking at using the stablecoin Tether to move money around. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand the phone, or the microphone, not the phone, the microphone over to the next person.
Thanks, Denisse. This is fascinating. The Central African Republic is really kind of a microcosm of the movement of, kind of more traditional money laundering techniques to the more modern ones. Brad, I know you probably can't get into too much detail, but how much of a concern is it from the U.S. government perspective, kind of Wagner's entrenching itself in countries such as the Central African Republic and getting access to resources? Also, this is happening in other countries in Africa.
Thanks. It's a significant concern. It's one that my boss, Ambassador O'Brien, and a lot of colleagues across the U.S. government are spending a lot of time on. I think, and it's an example of, as Denisse pointed out, this is not, although Wagner and Prigozhin are sort of getting more attention these days, especially given the role that Wagner and Prigozhin are playing in the war in Ukraine. And there's been a lot of connectivity between the armed groups that have existed and the mercenaries that have existed and been working in sub-Saharan Africa and those fighting in Ukraine. We've been taking action against the Wagner Group and Prigozhin for many years. There have been sanctions actions and other enforcement efforts against them for, I think, dating back to 2017 or 2018, and including related to gold, related to diamonds, related to their networks of disinformation and others. I think the important, and there's much more to come. I mean, and I think the Wagner Group itself has been sanctioned in multiple ways and multiple times under multiple authorities, sort of getting at the idea that this is a network and an enterprise that needs to be addressed through a lot of means. But I think 2 points I would just highlight. One is that working on these kinds of issues, the Central African Republic did not start to be a concern around the intersection of corruption and conflict and lack of governance when Wagner showed up. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie The Diplomat. It's a documentary from the early 2010s that I recommend everybody go watch, but it's a sort of undercover documentary film about someone going to the Central African Republic and getting involved in the conflict diamond trade through the guise of being a businessman. And it's a remarkable example of just sort of the systems that have existed in, as Senator Whitehouse said, sort of places where the rule of law has not been the priority. And so then the second thing is that in order to address a concern like the Wagner Group and the Prigozhin enterprise more broadly, you need exactly what we have on this panel. You need a really integrated and long-term and sustained strategy. There is no sort of single approach that addresses what happens in, frankly, largely ungoverned spaces or spaces that are governed by kleptocracies and that intersect with any number of industries and supply chains and value chains, and now add the sort of financial chain, literally and figuratively, that's sort of presented by crypto. I think what we have to see and what the US government is thinking a lot about these days is what are the sort of integrated and sustained and cooperative approaches we can take? How do we, when you talk about just the diamond supply chain, you're gonna have about 10 different steps and 20 different industries and sectors that will have a touch point on that, from mining and those who provide the inputs to mining, to traders, to airlines, to transport companies, to manufacturers, to financing companies, to jewelers, to industrial diamond users, to consumers, to all of us, right? And so there is some linkage to sort of everyone in this room and every one of us to sort of ask questions about how we are connected to concerns like the Wagner Group, which, I don't think anyone wakes up and thinks, how am I connected to a group of mercenaries in the Central African Republic? But the truth is we are, and I think that is at the sort of essence of what we're trying to do here. And from a government perspective, trying to think through how we build and integrate those measures over time is what we try to do, and hopefully we can get more into during the panel.
That's great, Brad. I think the takeaway from this panel is that we're all connected to the Wagner Group in one way or another. Hopefully not. But Liat, turning to you, you work for a blockchain monitoring company. Can you tell us, have you seen any concrete examples of laundering the proceeds of corruption using crypto? Crypto is a hot topic. Everyone likes to blame it for things. But what are the concrete examples that we can point to?
So the answer is yes. I've answered the question. Pardon me. I've answered the question. And before I come back for an in-depth kind of analysis of that, I just want to mention that we promised an informal interactive session. So I'm gonna give a short personal anecdote to share that relates to the crypto conversation, and I'll take it to crypto. I spent about 15 years in the Horn of Africa chasing cash and banging my head against the wall because you can't chase money. It disappears, it goes away, it changes hands at the speed of light. In Somalia and Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, I spent 15 years chasing cash. And then I had the unfortunate situation where two of my very close colleagues and friends, Simon Davis and Clement Gorison, who were also chasing cash, were assassinated in Somalia. And the proceeds of piracy and ransom that they were chasing, They were basically gunned down. And it's that point when I went to work for a bank in a cubicle, and I said, this is where I go to recover. So I'm also a recovering banker in that sense, where I needed to recover from this. I lasted about 6 months, and I went to work in Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan to continue and trace cash. In 2019, I sort of had an awakening. Long story short, I broke my ankle, I couldn't travel, and I'm sitting there thinking, how do we do this better? How do we follow money? How do we look at concepts of traceability, transparency, all of the concepts that are so important to this work? How do we do this better? And I fell in love with blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, and the particular use case at the moment is cryptocurrencies, and we can talk about the bad guys, the bad people. At the end of the day, greed. There's a lot that goes into that conversation. But when you look at the fundamental assets of blockchain technology, the traceability, the capability of going back to a Genesis block, think the first dollar, and following its infancy, its teenage year, its toddlerhood, you can see it through where it was born and that changing of the hand. And that capability is power, and that capability is massive. And so I look at those characteristics of distributed ledger technology and say, crypto's evolving, we're growing as an industry, we're learning how to do things, and we're gonna get better at it. There's gonna be massive scandals, we're seeing them left and right. There's gonna be hacks, there's opportunistic crime that's happening everywhere. But the bottom line is that when you think about the assets of technology and what it is that we need, the tools that we need to fight today and to fight corruption, I don't see a world in which technology is not part and parcel of that. And now I promise to answer the question. So in crypto, I spoke about this transparency, the transparency of the ledger, following the money. What we do at Elliptic as a blockchain analytics company, there's a few others out there who do this, is follow the transactions or the wallet. So if you're a former banker or a banker, you know that you do transaction monitoring, you do screenings of accounts, and you apply a risk-based approach in which you can try and see what risk score you would assign a particular customer, a particular account. So with crypto, we have a massive risk rule engine that categorizes things like arms trade, narcotics, proceeds of particular thefts or scams or Ponzi schemes, or entities like Hamas, Wagner Group, different entities. And we have a team of crypto intelligence analysts, CIAs, who are responsible for conducting investigations and essentially gathering assertions that provide the evidence trail of asserting that a particular wallet and a particular set of assets is owned and clustered to a particular group or entity. And so that kind of visibility into movement of money and funds is what makes very quick resolution to big market movements or big thefts, where you can track the money live and see it moving, and you can see illicit actors attempting to peel off funds and do what we would call money laundering obfuscation techniques to blur the lines, but that's ridiculous because there's a visualization of it and you see it happening. So when I hear of El Salvador and Central African Republic who have adopted Bitcoin, I would say that the volatility of Bitcoin in this particular time for those countries is almost destructive, and yet they have the power of blockchain analytics themselves, and they are following the money, and in fact they have really innovated on how it is that we do anti-money laundering and how it is that we follow proceeds of crime. Very specifically, the largest reinvestment or movement of proceeds of corruption are coming from Russian entities. You're seeing proceeds of what used to be a yacht show itself and be converted into crypto and move along. I don't think it's a secret that a majority of dark web marketplaces are operated at the end of the day by Russian entities at the back end, and once one is brought down, others reappear. When it comes to precious stones and diamonds and so on, from my experience, I'm allergic to diamonds, and I was proposed to with a crystal unicorn because I just don't do diamonds. But I think that there's much more that we can do in linking between the on-ramps and off-ramps to crypto, between banks, between cash-intensive businesses, the likes of these conversion points between, say, proceeds of jewelry and diamonds and so on. So there's work. But I'm happy to say that, from the private sector perspective, to the degree that I can be a representative of the one private sector company that I represent, there is tremendous willingness to be here and engage and talk and share and grow. And I look forward to the discussion, and we'll get off my soapbox right now.
Thank you so much. And I was proposed to as a sapphire for the same reason, so we have lots in common. I'm also a recovering banker. To recover, I went to work for a small NGO, but we also have a real live banker on our panel, and that's Heather. So let me turn to her for this moment. So Heather, working in the private sector, you work at Barclays. What have you seen that you think works? And what are some of the key challenges in your job, which is to tackle corruption?
Sure. Thank you, Justyna. So let me just start with a disclaimer, because I am a lawyer. So a recovering lawyer, like so many of us, that these are my own opinions and not that of Barclays. And let me just add an anecdote that I started at OFAC 2 weeks after Justyna, and Brad left OFAC 2 weeks before we started. So I don't know.
This is a very corrupt panel. We all know each other. Okay,
So I don't know what to read into Brad leaving before we left. But to answer your question, what works and what doesn't work. So I'll start with what works. And this will warm your heart, Justyna. It's engagement and cooperation with civil society. Yes, we're a bank, but we are not loaded with tons and tons of money to spend an unlimited amount of resource on working on issues to solve corruption. So we rely on so much out there in the public, such as what we read that gets produced by civil society. And I was a former prosecutor, as Justyna said, and it's not what you know, but it's what you can prove. So it's what is it that civil society has looked at in the reports, what's their evidence? So we're gonna look at not just reading the reports, but what are they basing their conclusions on? Because we need to see that, and we need to make ourselves comfortable that we can make a risk-based decision to either exit a client or bring on a client. And we've had great cooperation. I can even tell you that Justyna has made herself available to financial institutions to talk to them, to talk about their evidence, to talk about what they found and what they produced in their reports. And the second thing that I'll say that works is KYC and KYCC. So I came from OFAC, and we always said KYC, it's not KYCC. But in the reality, it is KYCC. We don't need to just know our clients. We need to know where they got their wealth. We need to know their business. But we also need to know their clients. So it's really just an understanding of the relationship. And relationships change over time. Businesses enter into other fields of business. But it's really incumbent upon the bankers who have these relationships to know their clients and to be feeding that back to the people who sit in the back of the house, the recovering lawyers, the bankers. You call me a banker, but I'm really not a banker. But the compliance shop who really needs to understand, well, who is it that's banking with us? Whose money is running through our pipes? Because that's so important for every financial institution to know. So now to what doesn't work. And I'm sorry, Brad, but I think it's the public-private cooperation. It works, but it doesn't work. I've seen so much more sharing of information under this administration. I saw the engagement that the White House and the Treasury was doing before Russia invaded. I'm a sanctions nerd. You read the papers and you know where sanctions are going. But to really have engagement with the government where they're coming out to the financial industry and saying, if Russia invades, X will happen. I mean, they weren't coming out there and saying, here are our top targets, but you had to have had your head in the sand if you didn't know where the government was going. But to really hear the government coming forward and talking to us and telling us what's going to happen. But what isn't more apparent and what would help more is to know their policies and their focus and where they're going with corruption. Like, sure, we all know the car, we can read the car. I pulled up my phone and I was saying to Brad, I think I wrote that executive order on the car. But to know who are the other actors that they're focusing on, so we can understand, do we have any relationships, not with these entities, like the Wagner Group, but do they touch us? Do we have a client that maybe does business with somebody that's connected to these corrupt actors? So it's the more sharing of information and the more questions you ask me, the more I'm going to sort of talk about this. But, how many of us have security clearances at the government? 4 of us. So there are trusted partners out there in the industry who the government could engage with a bit more.
Thank you, Heather. And you've touched on a point that when I get on my high horse, I talk a lot. So now I work from civil society, have worked in government, have worked at a bank, and sometimes, I have these discussions with civil society where there's a huge mistrust of the banking industry. And yes, I'm not an apologist for the banks. They've messed up. They've messed up royally over and over and over again. But what you have to know is that there are good people that work at the banks, like Heather, but many, many others that work in compliance who are not profit, motivated. Their bonus does not depend on the business they bring in, like many other people at banks. What they need is information so they can counter their counterparts in the business. They need to be able to convince the business why doing this is a bad idea, and they can't do that because, I read some story or I think the Wagner Group is bad, they're a bad idea. They need to show extra proof to, say the reputational risk is just too high to do this business. Look who they do business with. And, at the Sentry, it's this KYCC that we really rely on to do our work. A lot of the times, we can't make a difference, with someone in the car, a business in the car, but we can find out who banks them. And we go to that bank and we say, listen, we heard you do business with X, Y, and Z. This is what we've uncovered. And it's that pressure, the fear of reputational risk, where I think civil society can really have a big impact working with the financial sector, getting the right information to the right people at the right institutions like Heather.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Justyna. And so much of the transactions that the industry looks at, yes, they're legal, but it's the reputational risk. I sit in Washington, this is the Washington Post test. Do you want it on the front page of the paper that ABC financial institution did business with X, Y, and Z? So it really is equipping everybody with the information and the evidence. It's sort of what I said. It's not what you know, but what can you prove?
Great. So shifting a little bit to Jane, our final member of our panel, who works at Celo, not Celo, Celo I recently learned, and obviously has been an attorney in the past at the DOJ. But can you share some thoughts from your experience at Celo, but also in your past life on the use of technology and why it's essential for public-private partnerships?
Thank you. Well, very happy to be here. Before I talk about the technology, I do think that I came into the Web3 blockchain space in a very unique way. I spent most of my career as a prosecutor investigating money laundering and financial crimes related to victims, whether it was human trafficking, child exploitation, forced labor. And I know we've been talking a lot about cooperation, but I wouldn't be here if I hadn't met Justyna and others from the Sentry when I really needed help at the Department of Justice when I was in the money laundering section, because I was the only trial attorney focused on trying to track down money in really difficult victim cases. Many of the victims were abroad. Some were victims of genocide or human rights violations. And I can't do it alone. These crimes aren't siloed. We don't live in a world where I personally, and these are my personal views obviously, you can do it alone. and you have to rely on people with expertise. While I was a prosecutor and can put a case together into the grand jury or present it to 12 common people at a trial, I don't have the expertise to know what the culture and norms are in the DRC or in Myanmar, and how that may be different from victim to victim. But what I also found was that there are hurdles to bringing a victim to becoming a survivor to actually being able to thrive in a society and have access to financial, whether it's banking services or something where they don't have what we take for granted, whether it's credit scores or ways to prove who we are, right? And the reason I say all of this is I also worked on a lot of supply chain forced labor cases. And one thing that I found was, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could go back to the company or that multinational organization and say, actually, you can trace on a public ledger, as Liat said, all the way down your supply chain, and that you know who's picking up the cocoa in Mali or Cote d'Ivoire. And you can't say that you have no ability and no way to use technology and those resources to accomplish that. And it's the same when we're looking at the Wagner Group or minerals. And then fast forward, you also, when you're a prosecutor doing complex white-collar financial crimes, know that most of the time, just as technology quickly innovates and becomes something that we use, and I'm not technologically savvy, though I've become much more than I was when I was at the government, the bad actors are moving much faster than we are. And there's a lot of times where my investigators, my agents, and I had to rely on companies and subject matter experts like Liat and others who can show us and use technology to make our investigations faster. Because most of the time, the issues that we faced from banks were, we don't know, they don't know, whether that suspicious activity report that they're filing is getting to the right person at the Justice Department or getting to the right agent, and how do you act on it? And let me be honest, I can send a lot of, I can't now, but when I was in government, I could send grand jury subpoenas for records, but I need time to analyze them. I need time to understand, is that a shell company? How do I get the documents from overseas? If you have information that is stored on a public, trustless, decentralized blockchain that can be verified, whether you're sitting here in this conference room or in London or in Moscow, that builds trust in and of itself because there's no one owner of that data. And that can be used by any one of us for whatever specific needs we're trying to accomplish, hopefully together, fighting kleptocracy. But it does not surprise me that sophisticated money launderers are going to move from using cash, right, that does disappear, that's very hard to trace, was always a problem in all of our financial investigations, but also move to then buying assets, real world assets, buying art, laundering their money through art, and now moving to what I would say is a more new form of digital asset, whether it's Bitcoin or something else. To me, it's silly to think that they're moving to Bitcoin because Bitcoin is publicly available on the blockchain. And usually the question I get is, why don't they use a privacy coin, right? Which is, so many have heard of Monero, and usually the liquidity is the problem. So if you're a bad actor and you're a sophisticated white collar criminal, you have too much money that you're trying to launder through the traditional financial system that you then have to use Bitcoin. And Leah and her company and a lot of other analytic firms can help in real time get that data to law enforcement in a way that when I was at the Justice Department, if I was doing a traditional financial investigation, I might need years to analyze all of the data that I'm getting.
Thank you. This is fascinating. And the liquidity point, I remember when Russia first invaded Ukraine, a lot of people were like, oh, Russia is now just going to move completely to crypto, and people forgot, like, you can't move an entire economy, the 11th largest economy in the world, to crypto. There's just not enough liquidity. But Liat, I don't know if you could build on Jane's answer. What can blockchain help us do better than traditional investigative tools? Given your example of the yacht and the oligarch and moving the proceeds to crypto, if the government wants to seize those assets or investigate it, how can it do that?
Sure. So before we jump into the investigations piece, I would challenge the assumption that when it comes to blockchain and conducting investigations on movement of funds or value on a blockchain, you don't even need to get to the investigation phase. I would say to a bank, to other institutions, that you don't even need to cash out to particular entities, because you will see that a particular entity is cashing out with a risk exposure that already compromises that particular wallet, or that wallet is controlled by an illicit actor that has, to a degree of confidence, kind of a bad, nefarious actor. So you don't even need to investigate. You can see it, so don't give them the money, right? Like, done, check. So that's one angle of it, which is pre-screening. You screen before you cash out, and I think that's part of the beauty and what I appreciate. The other piece is, I just want to touch on the time. So we work with law enforcement, and they can literally walk in and be tracing something, and use an iPad to follow, or find, they'll find a computer, they'll find someone's phones, and they'll be able to seize private keys that are essentially the equivalent of a password to your email account, and with that be able to transfer the funds into a wallet that they control. And so in that way, they're essentially able to seize those funds. And you see that law enforcement is then able to process those monies through other law enforcement, through other regulatory agencies and other bodies, and almost reissue or auction off that crypto, much as they would auction a seized house. So the processes are starting to get there. This idea of having a national wallet that is a seized wallet, where assets can be deposited, custodied, and controlled. When it comes to sanctions, I think we see the true power of blockchain and crypto come to play, because you can see almost the risk exposure that you would have to a group like the Lazarus Group, the Wagner Group. We're all connected. You could see to what percentage of a particular account has touched a dark market, or is coming from illicit proceeds, and you can act risk-based approach on that, and either report it or file on it, or engage. The challenge at the moment that I think is a fundamental kind of barrier, which I think also requires public-private innovation, is something we talked about previously, which is the concept of KYC and Know Your Customer. I almost want to introduce a new concept called Flex KYC, which is the idea of, we need to be able to do better at identifying how it is that my identity is known online and offline as I straddle those activities that I conduct. Because what we're seeing at the moment is that there's a bit of a blind spot where online activities aren't as easily connected. And I think a lot of the crypto industry is really doing a lot to try and mimic and innovate on KYC, sovereign KYCs, new concepts, tokenized KYC. So trying to do better at identifying and connecting to said oligarch, so that said oligarch and PEPs, also I would innovate on politically exposed people and say, we need to be doing better on who is defined as a PEP, and how does that translate to assets online. And so sanctions, listings, we work collaboratively with OFAC. We brief them every quarter. We're happy to just come in and say, hello, OFAC, here's everything that we're seeing. And I think that's welcomed, and we really appreciate that agencies are really, now listing wallets. So we serve as kind of a force multiplier, and anybody who's screening wallets and come up against a sanctioned wallets, that's it. They don't have to cash out. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I will stop there.
No, you did. Turning back to Heather, I mean, as a traditional financial institution representative, although you're speaking for yourself, kind of how do you guys work with the crypto industry, or how do you see traditional finance and crypto interacting?
So I'm just going to start with like the nuclear option here is that I think crypto's bad. Like just put it on the table. I think it's horrible. I know that I might be taken out back by Liat here. And I have lots of friends in the crypto industry. Thank you. So just what we were hearing previously, Denisse was talking about the car and crypto. Liat even talked about crypto and bad actors. What I'd see with crypto is, I know you're saying there's lots of transparency, but it's what the senators say. You don't have transparency, you don't know who's who. So I can't look at a wallet and say exactly, oh, well, that's Justyna Gudzowska over there with this wallet. Yes, you can trace the wallets, there's history with the wallets, but there isn't the transparency that I think you see with fiat, and you know your customers. You look at a wallet, and I don't think I know. You're like, I can see it over there. So I just don't think there's a lot of benefit from crypto. Yes, it can serve to bank the unbanked. I mean, we were talking about this before the conference, Jane and I, about Celo and certain things that you're seeing and the banking. Where you can't get traditional banking, where there is no Wi-Fi and you're relying on broadband. So yes, there are benefits, but I do look at crypto and I see it as the hijacking of the 70s. Crypto really, ransomware exploded when crypto exploded. Yes, I understand people can harden their servers and make sure, you're not vulnerable to attackers, but I just see so much more harm with crypto than good. I know that I'm perhaps stand alone in saying that here, but I just want to put it out there. So, sorry.
No, I mean, this is supposed to be a lively discussion, and the whole reason behind this panel is that at the end, Liat, Heather, and Jane are going to be best friends, and we would have made progress and trust. I don't know if, Jane, you want to add on that.
No, I actually think that Heather's point is healthy for the industry because there isn't enough discussion about how do we get mass adoption for the communities that are living in financial deserts, or for using blockchain for supply chains, or identifying beneficial ownership. I think the issue is crypto, right? The digital asset itself is just one piece of the broader technology that isn't going anywhere, right? And so in order for the technology to serve the benefit that ultimately I think it will bring, just like we now have the internet and we don't have a modem, and we can have a flip phone in Kenya give access to a farmer to actually pay for things for his family, or weavers in Vietnam during COVID when tourists aren't going, is by ensuring that companies like Celo, we're a foundation. If we're giving out grants, we do KYC. I do use analytic firms to verify wallets, and not just the wallet, but their counterparty and counterparty risks. So I think we all in each of our industries and in government have to educate ourselves on what our obligations are, and only then, when there are more discussion and focus on the use cases and on what this technology can do, can we actually get mass adoption? Can we get partnerships between traditional financial institutions and the blockchain industry? Because crypto, it's like this term we throw around, and not a lot of people know what it actually means. So I appreciate that comment, and I think that is why there needs to be more education, and there has to be more education among government and law enforcement. There's a lot of conversations about what is the CFTC or the SEC doing in the US. But there's DOJ and the Department of Justice, and OFAC is including wallet addresses and sanctioning, and that has to happen. There has to be enforcement for bad actors so that good actors can actually have a voice in this space.
And I think, you were talking about the SEC and OFAC, I think there, and I hate to say this, but I think there needs to be more regulations. You need to control it more because to me, I go back to my analogy, it's the hijacking of the 70s, with ransomware. And we really only fixed hijacking 21 years ago, So I don't know what the Band-Aid is, or I don't know what the fix is for crypto, so you don't look at some people, like myself, look at it and see that it's just a means for bad actors to facilitate their bad activity. And the other thing, now I just forgot my thought, but the other thing that I look at is it's sort of the Washington Post test. Do you want crypto to be on one hand, and you hear about Tornado Cash or North Korea and all the money that they made through crypto and ransomware and the car, and then be on the front paper that this financial institution is involved in crypto. I just think that they're.
Yeah. And maybe the answer is, don't hate the tool, hate the people misusing it, It's just a tool, it's a technology, but it has been misused, and I think that's what we're getting at. But I know Liat and Brad, you had wanted to comment, so Brad, do you want to quickly?
So just two quick burning comments, I suppose. But one is I really appreciate the conversation because I think it's an important one. Being crypto skeptic is healthy. Being skeptical about anything is important. We ask questions and we air it out. I think the bottom line is that a majority of proceeds of crime and money laundering are still being shuttled, moved, and mobilized through traditional financial institutions. And let's just put that there. And then next to that, less than 1% of all crypto transactions and crypto economy at the moment is, still that illicit area. And so I think we're still at that point where we can pendulum towards positive use cases, hold venture capitalists who are investing in projects to a higher standard, to have them, put more money towards due diligence of who they're funding. Why are they funding? Humans are greedy. We're greedy people. It's a fact that women who come to venture capitalists will be grilled on due diligence 90% more than men who come with a proposal on a napkin. And it's one of those things where you can say, well, we can do things differently. We need to account for human behavior and technology. And so I really like the clash of civilization mentioned by Senator Whitehouse earlier, because I would add that it's a clash of civilizations, rule of law, and so on, but also tech and how it is that humans behave with tech and governance and regulation and transparency of regulation and those conversations. I see a world in which we're moving towards hybrid adoption, because at the end of the day, we want to see financial integrity, financial inclusion, and root out corrupt entities to the degree that we're not blocked by the bazillions of entities that Senator Whitehouse was saying show up to protest. So I'll stop.
Thanks. I've wanted to jump in so many times, but very conscious of being the only male on the panel and not wanting to live out a cliche of jumping in and. So
where's your napkin?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if only I was. I will. I have. Thoughts on a bunch of things. I don't have much thoughts on crypto, frankly. And I will follow Heather's lead and give the caveat. These are my thoughts and words, and not necessarily the official views of the U.S. government or Ambassador O'Brien. But having, like Justyna, sort of worked in all three of these categories of civil society, industry, and government, a few things have jumped out. And keeping up with the cliche for me, for those of you who know me, I'm a big music fan. You all are visiting Washington, which is the home of many things. It is also the home of one of the greatest centers of punk rock in the world. And I hope some of you will get a chance to see some music while you're here. One of the great sort of bands in punk rock from DC, Fugazi, once had in there a song, I don't want to make the same mistakes. I know how much time that wastes. Function is the key. And that line has been kind of coming, those lines have been coming up to me throughout this conversation because they are very reminiscent of what we went through, what we have gone through in the diamond supply chain and gold supply chain. And function is the key to means we have to learn the lessons that we have to act on the lessons we've learned. We spend a lot of time learning lessons and less time acting on them. And to me, the lesson of the diamond supply chain is there has been a lot of effort that has gone into certifying good stuff and not really acknowledging bad stuff, right? The Kimberley process and various jewelry initiatives, all of them are designed to demonstrate to those of you who are getting crystal unicorns and sapphires that that actually 95% of the diamond supply chain is fine and good and doing and benefiting the people. And honestly, that's largely true. But the issue is that we care about that other 5% and who's involved in that and where that money is going and what harm is being done with it. And so I certainly have seen in the crypto world a lot of the use case and discussions about all the things that it can do. And I think if we spend time sort of focused on because of the Washington Post test, nobody wants to be in the Washington Post having said, actually there are problems with this. Like this thing isn't quite working the way we wish it worked, and here's what we're doing to try to address it. It's usually like, this thing is working, right? There's a lot of effort sort of certifying things that we already know are probably fine. Like the amount of time that, your bank probably spends going through processes to know customers who you already know, as opposed to really diving in and trying to identify the risks of maybe that customer's customer who you don't know. That's a lot of time and effort and money, but that's probably like I don't think we have the balance between how much time do I have to document and make sure that I know the customer that I already know versus all the resources it'll take to figure out who that guy is in the middle of the Central African Republic, who is my customer's customer's customer probably. But that's where the bad stuff is. And I don't think on any level of government, industry, or civil society, we have gotten to a level where we are willing to really acknowledge what we don't do well, and willing to be honest. And I've been on a high horse for many years about reporting requirements and transparency. The purpose of being, here are the things that we don't know, here are the things that we're trying to do and we wish we could do better and we're making mistakes. And from a civil society perspective, I've had many conversations with NGOs where I wish that when a company did a report or a bank did a report saying like, hey, we found these problems in our supply chain and we're trying to address them, often the civil society reaction to that is, this company is terrible because these things happened. And I think we have to be in a position where, not that we should pat a company on the back for reporting on something, but doing this kind of collaborative work of engaging on how do we address these problems together, because none of civil society, government, or private sector can do this alone. And in addition to talking about the tools we have, we also have to acknowledge the shortcomings we have and where we need that work. And I like the term flex KYC. I will end by this intervention by stealing a term that another badass woman in the sort of mineral supply chain has coined lean in due diligence, right? And I think that's what we all, lean in due diligence to me means ask the questions, but then like actually follow up on the answer and take action. I think a lot of due diligence and a lot of KYC processes have become routinized and are less focused on, it's more important to me to get at the 2 or 3 bad actors than it is to be sure that the 1,000 people that I know are fine are actually fine. And I think if we can move ourselves into a world where we're comfortable with uncomfortable due diligence processes and uncomfortable KYC, then whether crypto's good or bad matters less than how we're working together to address the bad people who have misused every tool. I think the point you make is a good, like, diamonds are not good or bad, they're just a rock from carbon in the middle of the surface. Like, how they're used may be good or bad, and I think crypto is largely the same. Anyway.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I think the point of this panel is that no one can be an expert in everything. No one can devote tons of resources, or not everyone can devote lots of resources to focusing on South Sudan or the car. And, an organization like the Sentry, that's where they're focused on, but we have less of an understanding of other things. So it's this information sharing, this cooperation, bringing in different areas of expertise and not being in our own anti-corruption bubble or our, private sector bubble and talking. So I want to leave time for questions at the end, but since I asked you the first question, Denisse, and you've been sitting here quietly ever since, I want to make sure you can, kind of say your thoughts on the discussion.
Oh, there are so many. First of all, this is possibly one of my favorite panels that I have ever been on, with the baddest women of financial crime prevention, I guess, and corruption and Brad. Crystal unicorns, sapphires. It's kind of amazing. So when we were asked to put together this panel, I'm a fixer. I like to come up with solutions for things. How do we dismantle kleptocracies together? This is, Brad was talking about collaboration. I'd actually just written down traceability, transparency, trust, cooperation, collaboration. I'm a big believer in bringing people together to build bridges of understanding. Sorry, I'm clearly having a really good time putting my thoughts together. I'm jet lagged, long day yesterday. Everybody on this panel has a different perspective on how to tackle, or a different view on how to tackle one issue. Civil society, it's been an honor to work in civil society because the passion that people who tend to work in civil society, that they bring, but also the ability to go on the ground and gather the intelligence, to gather the evidence that's needed to bring kind of corrupt actors to account, often under threat to life, is something that I don't think people think about that often. We've had the opportunity at the Sentry of kind of building public-private partnerships. We're working with the United Nations, the Oslo Declaration on Vast Quantities of Assets, to make sure that when they talked about public-private partnerships, there's also reference to civil society. The G20 communique recently in Bali also made reference to civil society and academia for the first time ever in reference to public-private partnerships, because there's still we've talked about lack of trust. And it isn't just a lack of trust and a lack of understanding between the banking community and the crypto communities. It isn't just a lack of trust between government and finance, because again, you also see sometimes I have been approached previously and said, can you maybe help us get in touch with some of the banks? And this is a government official. I'm like, but you're like Treasury. You should be able to do this yourself. Like, why are you talking to a civil society organization? And also kind of, academia. So there are a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of lessons learned that we can kind of hopefully prevent from becoming future mistakes and future, the lessons already been learned. But I think the only way to be able to do that is to communicate, to talk, to co-create, to collaborate. All of these wonderful, wonderful words to tackle, corruption. But I had a flashback as I was sitting here between to something that wasn't mentioned. I created the first crypto working group in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. And that was, I saw that the crypto industry was going to be regulated. I talked to the FATF, and lovely, wonderful. But in terms of understanding of how the blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies and assets and digital assets work, there was definitely a massive gap. But even now, and there was a meeting, and it kind of had flashbacks to similar kind of, although this was much nicer. It was a very combative meeting between traditional finance and crypto. And the way I see it is crypto is just the use of new technology to do what traditional finance has been doing. And there are so many areas of overlap and so many areas where actually the industry could learn from traditional banking. Travel rule, they did that about 2001 after September 11. KYC, again, they've been doing that for years. Should it be risk-based, as Brad says? Yes, maybe don't spend like millions and trillions of dollars redoing everything that on things that you know are fine. So I don't know, what am I saying? In conclusion, I am very happy to be on this panel. I love the fact that we've had somebody from government who can look at policy, think about the political implications and the national security implications of the Wagner Group. Somebody from banking who can look at the financial flows, who's able to look at fiat and how that kind of flows in the world. That we've had somebody from crypto blockchain monitoring who can go back to the Genesis block, and I love the toddlerhood, the adulthood, the teenagehood. Sorry, I missed one.
1-year-old.
Oh, it's amazing. That we have somebody from Celo who's creating, using blockchain for good and creating new forms of identity for people who are unbanked and have issues with being unbanked, and innovating in this space, because that can then be fed back through. And then of course, Justyna is just amazing in civil society. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great sum up. And as promised, we have time for questions. Please don't be shy. We have Charlie here in the front who has a microphone, and he'll come to you there.
Microphone check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Good morning, thank you panel, very interesting. My name's Jonathan Lyles. I'm part of His Majesty's Revenue and Customs at the UK government, but I'm currently situated here in DC. Very interesting. I'll keep it brief from me. We did touch upon it, I think Heather mentioned it, about Tornado Cash and tumblers and mixers, and whilst I can kind of get on board with the crypto side of it and the means of as a legitimate platform, I can't fully understand any legitimate purpose for tumblers stroke mixers. So I'd just like to canvass the panel on that and articulate their views. Thank you.
Who wants to answer that?
So I think there's, again, a difference between the technology and why that exists and how people use it, right? And I think there also has to be an understanding, just like in traditional finance, that if you are a bad actor and you're using a particular technology to evade sanctions, commit mass atrocities, and plunder funds from your own community, if you are doing it to fund terrorists, that there are consequences and that there is enforcement. And I think there has to be, at the same time, knowledgeable enforcement, both from regulators and law enforcement, to understand who actually controls the technology and who should be held accountable for that. I think Liat can probably talk to how analytic firms help law enforcement identify through blockchain on chain. For example, with Tornado Cash, right? It had to do with the Lazarus Group. So I think to be a good actor in any space, you have to understand what your responsibilities are, take those responsibilities seriously, and it doesn't matter whether it's a tumbler, a mixer. There are debates over individuals who were using Tornado Cash to send funds to Ukraine because they didn't want to have the threat of life if someone in Russia or the Russian government identified them as supporting the Ukrainian effort to defend their own country. So there's always going to be a use case that we can use as this is a good and this is a bad, but there should be thoughtful regulation and there should be consequences for bad actors, regardless of what the technology is that they're using to commit their crime. I mean, maybe that's me as a former federal prosecutor, right? But there have to be consequences. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if Heather spends all of her time devoting effort to keep dirty money out of the bank, or we at Celo do our best to ensure that on our decentralized protocol, if I'm giving funds to a project, that I know that those are vetted people and real due diligence, not that give me a napkin and say, I met you at a bar and you seem great, so here you go, right? Like there should be accountability, and if you are a bad actor, you should be held accountable.
Just want to add 2 quick sentences. First of all, I also appreciate the question coming from HMRC, and I'm delighted that you're thinking about these topics and have chosen to sit in on our panel, so thank you. I think for those of you who aren't kind of in the know on tornado cash and all this, I'd layer it up and say there is a set of technologies that are essentially privacy-enhancing technologies. They are anonymizers. They kind of allow us to commingle money. They will allow us to disassociate from identity. And that kind of category of technology right now is a question mark for a lot of regulators trying to figure out, why do we need this? Why are we, why is this even around? This question of, is there a use case for this? And so everything that we just heard, but also I would say, there's a very specific, simple use case that comes to privately owning assets and and private value. And we know that in a sense that not all of our salaries are public to everybody. I want to know what everybody in this room makes. Why? Why should I know that? It's none of my business. It's your information. It's data privacy. This idea that you should be able to privately control, own, and manage your information is important. It's fundamental. It's part of this data privacy conversation. It's part of this, this ownership. So I think what we're seeing is a gap between how privacy-enhanced technologies are being used and misused and the governance regime around them. And that gap is allowing, it's almost like the maturity of each of the industry versus the governance, and then the misuse is all kind of intertwining. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use for good privacy-enhancing technologies in a sense that they can, we can contribute to ideological causes privately, and we can contribute finances and value in ways that don't expose us and risk our families and risk our lives and so on. And so, I would argue the use cases are there. Have they been kind of mainstreamed? No. We're still seeing it primarily being misused by criminals. And I think that's a loophole. So we need to tackle that one. Yes.
So I'm just going to throw in there also, if you're looking at civil society and state surveillance in countries that are using blockchain monitoring for state surveillance purposes, then that could be another use case. But again, the technology is agnostic. It's the use.
Hi, and thank you for the really interesting panel. I'm Hector from the Honduras Business Council, and I have, for Honduras and Central America, remittances are super important. For Honduras, it's 28% of our GDP, and someone mentioned El Salvador, it's 24% right now. And going back to the Senator's comments about using institutions for bad actors and the hijacking as well. I remember an article about how implementing the Chivo wallet in El Salvador was going to hit the banks for about $500 million a year in remittances, commissions. And so it's and the cartels are also present there. The drugs aren't sold there, they're sold here, and somehow that cash is converted to crypto. But how can we balance that benefit of, taking the hit for the people that are receiving the remittances in those countries, and probably those are the first adopters, and then the banks and that come up and lobby, that's probably a hit for them. And so I know the dangers, but there's also real benefits, real impact on people in small countries. Yeah. And so it's not a question, but a comment that I'd like a reaction on. Yeah.
I'll just do a quick comment on this. Is we saw a lot of this in our human trafficking cases where the remittances were going to Latin and South America, and part of why, for example, it made a lot of sense was you knew when you were sending it who it was going to, and you didn't have to pay exorbitant fees if you were going to use Western Union or MoneyGram, which could be, if you're sending a small amount that you've worked very hard for, it could be 30% of that amount, which you don't have. You're also potentially sending your loved ones to a brick and mortar where everyone knows that if you're going in, you're actually getting fiat out. And that subjects you to potentially physical harm. So I think there have been a lot of efforts by projects like the Celo Foundation, others in the space, about actually collaborating with traditional financial institutions to allow for on and off ramps in countries so that individuals who don't have a bank account but need to get funds to their families, that they can actually do that. The challenge is getting the technology that you need in country so that you do have an off-ramp so that those individuals and those communities can actually use whatever digital asset. The flip side of that is if you have an autocratic regime and they're issuing the digital currency, they can also be using it to launder their own kleptocratic for their own benefit. So there is, again, always there's a way to hopefully use it for good, but we can't be blind that it can also be misused or used as a tool to keep someone in power because they're offering this benefit to their community, but then using it to really control them.
Can I just make a 1 minute, not exactly responsive comment, which is, from the Sanctions Coordinator's office, I mean, we spend a lot of time wrestling with issues that are, where there are a lot of competing objectives, right? And I think one problem we often have from whatever part we sit in is there are lots of hard choices and hard policy objectives that don't fit together. And so remittances is a great example, as is, you know, mining in the Central African Republic. Like, in many ways you would say, well, it should just be shut down because all it's doing is leading to the Wagner Group, and if you shut it down, then lots of other bad things happen, right? And I think the challenge that we see on all of these challenging issues, at some point someone has to make a choice, and oftentimes, frankly, policymakers don't want to make choices. They want to sort of do more research and have more discussions, and at some point, people have to make choices, and companies have to make choices about what they're going to do or not do. And the important part of, again, this panel and this sort of principle is, you know, most of those choices are like, meh, there was some good benefit to it, but there are problems. So, like, how do we keep getting better and how do we improve? And I think remittances in various places, traditional ones or impacting through crypto, we all have to wrestle with the ideas of how do we continue to improve and escalate and think through what are we trying to achieve, and if we're trying to achieve 5 different things, which one are we going to sort of go with and move ahead on?
Yeah, I mean, you guys stay? We don't mind staying.
Maybe we can hear some of the questions at once.
Yeah, maybe we'll take a few at once and then we'll offer, yeah.
Hi, my name is Nurul. I represent Freedom for Eurasia organization. And actually, I was interested, and I'll build on the previous questions as well. I'm interested about the sanction evasion issue. And actually, what are the effective ways of counter? We can take example of Russia, for example, using other republics of former Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, you know, for import-export. So maybe there's some points you can make about that.
Я извиняюсь, я буду говорить на русском, и мой друг переведет мне.
I'm gonna speak Russian and I'm gonna translate for him.
Я бизнесмен, который пострадал от путинского режима и алиевского режима.
I'm a businessman who suffered from Putin's regime and Aliyev's regime.
Сегодня после больших санкций остановить войну в Украине мы видим, что опять через отмывание денег и через наличные, и через криптовалюту российская преступная и азербайджанская элита имеет эти деньги также в Европе и в Америке и везде.
Today, after big sanctions on Russia and trying to stop war in Ukraine, we still see a lot of Russian heavy money in different form of currency in other countries.
Сегодня после того, как закрыли банковский доступ, карты, мастер, виза, российская преступная элита через наличные пункты в России есть, через наличные, через крипту эти же деньги имеют в Америке, в Европе, в Азии, везде во всем мире. Как будет дальше, мой вопрос, действуют люди, которые сегодня в санкциях, дальше занимаются этим, как будет правительство Америки и мировое сообщество дальше останавливать преступную элиту России.
Today that the Russians don't have access to debit card or credit cards, Visa, but they keep in money in cash in different countries. And my question is, what is government gonna do and how they gonna stop that?
Should we maybe tackle the, one more, and then we'll, okay, right here. Yeah. We'll do 2 more questions after this one, so 3 more total, here and there.
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Hello, my name is Sol Kraus, and I work with the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is a World Bank UNODC partnership. Thank you for such a wonderful panel. It's been really fantastic. I would be super interested in your quick thoughts on what more multilateral institutions could do to help contain some of the effects of money flows to fuel conflict and corruption. Of course, kind of wear a lot of different hats on the UN side. We play a role in kind of forming, creating norms, but also trying to help implement the UN Convention Against Corruption. The World Bank is a lending institution, so kind of there's a lot of, a big role that they can play there. We also provide technical assistance. We're very involved in the beneficial ownership debate and did a session here yesterday to look at nominees and some other things. But yeah, I think very engaging conversation, and yeah, would be interested in your thoughts on what else multilateral institutions could do. Thanks.
Two more questions. I think here and there, and then we're done. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Shah Pam from Nigeria. I'm from the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies, which is based in Jos, Nigeria. So let me just thank you for sharing your thoughts based on your experiences on how the financial system is being used around the world. I'm also quite happy that you've mentioned some examples from Africa, for example, the Central African Republic. And it shows clearly that the globe is quietly related. So what happens in Africa is going to affect the financial system generally. But I'm quite interested. As I go back home, I'm learning lessons, from what you've said. For instance, you're dealing with very, very strong systems here. For instance, in the global north. Countries in the global south, we're still facing a lot of problems. And I think when I do a study of the West African sub-region on on money laundering and terrorist financing, what has come out very clearly is that many countries using the mutual evaluation systems, we know clearly that some countries are making efforts, in ensuring that legislations, are enacted by the various parliaments, and also implementation is being done. But quite a lot is still happening. For instance, the whole of the systems that you've described here are quite complex, and people are trying to grapple, with this complexity and understanding how, and to understand how these things go on. Secondly, there are issues around investigation. Many of the institutions that are in charge of investigation still have a lot of problems. Disagreements on the use of extant laws and the use of new laws, money laundering and counterterrorism laws. So there's that conflict. Some of the judges, for instance, are still dealing with old systems, are not trying to connect, suspicious crimes, to money laundering. So as we discuss this, we should understand that there are different systems, countries, there are different contexts that things are happening. Some are doing very well, some are not doing very well. And the conclusion that I think we should take on board is how we, from systems that are still very weak, should work together, with you who have systems that are working. And this collaboration is very key. And I think that's at the heart of the discussion. How do we work together, to deal with the criminal systems? Thank you very much.
Do you want one more, or is that's a pretty full
I don't know
plate?
if he's been
Okay.
very free. Yeah.
But we are available afterwards as well, so
we
we
can
happy
stick
to
around.
take
So
comments.
one more here, and then one lady in the back, and then we'll do our best to do a speed round. Answering questions.
Yes, can I? I'm Abdelaziz from Morocco. I wonder about legal status of crypto money in the United States. If someone who is not involved in criminal activities, but create himself through, I know in my country, some young people creating a capital of crime and being able to buy estates in Spain, for example. Is that possible in the United States?
Congratulations on the World Cup, by the way. Since you mentioned Spain, too.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marjorie Krause, and I'm with APCO Worldwide. And for our second office in 1988 was in Moscow. So we've watched this drama play out over time. And I wanted to follow up on the question, we've been talking about how to prevent things. We've dealt a lot over the years with clients whose assets have been taken by using state processes that have been corrupt and have gotten, there are a number of people where courts around the world have legitimized the claims, and there have been findings, and now, of course, there's no collection. And I just wondered, in terms of accountability, how you feel about seizing of assets or otherwise making sure that legitimate claims are pushed forward so that there's an understanding that there are consequences to actions.
Yeah, we will be here to talk. So maybe we'll do kind of a lightning round and go through and everyone answer the most appropriate questions. So I know on the asset seizure, Jane, I'll start with you.
Sure. So in the U.S., when we investigated money laundering, asset forfeiture, we have criminal and civil forfeiture authorities to identify, seize, and forfeit assets in cases where we worked, for example, with the Sentry, where it had to do with potentially victims of kleptocratic or similar regimes. We were not just tied to seizing assets in the U.S. if we could prove that they were used or facilitated the criminal activity. That is unique in the U.S. That we have those both criminal and civil forfeiture authorities, which means that if there are assets in the U.S. and the individuals who are actually perpetrating the crime, we can still seize and forfeit those assets in the U.S. And if there are victims that are identified, and there's different, I can talk offline about this, the primary goal for the Justice Department was always to release those funds back to the victims. Very briefly on, in theory, yes, in the US, if it's a private sale, someone could accept digital assets, whether Bitcoin or another digital asset, as payment. There has been maybe one or two cases, I think sort of as a test run for buying real estate in the US, but it is not something, and I'll speak for me personally, when I was at the Department of Justice, I saw regularly. But there's no legal prohibition on that.
World Bank star. Happy to have a coffee. Lots of ideas. Happy to share these. Not going to go through them right now, but we do have a plethora of policy recommendations for multilaterals and ideas. With regards to Nigeria and the use of mutual alienation reviews, yeah, I agree that there needs to be more local context to take into account how society actually operates and how society moves money and what is necessary and what is needed. The FATF is working on effectiveness and that kind of area, but the recommendations that we tend to make to the FATF is around maybe looking at the local context to make the recommendations and see how different parts of society and different industries operate and move money around.
Yeah, do you want to take also the sanctions evasion through crypto question?
Yeah, sure. I had comments to our star colleague, but I see she's just left, so I'm going to skip that. I'm happy to chat with anyone anytime. I love to talk, so happy I'm around. And if you want coffee, I would love coffee. So just to chat on the sanctions evasion piece. So from a crypto perspective, blockchain analytics perspective, the OFAC list, the UN list, the Japan list, the Israeli list of terrorists, the EU list, whatever list exists, and particularly if it's listing crypto addresses or wallets or entities, we crunch that data, it's fed into our tool, and anybody who uses blockchain analytics will get an alert, will get a flag, will be receive indication that they are with exposure or interacting with a sanctioned entity. And we've been, from a crypto compliance perspective, very adamant that it's a zero-sum game when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to OFAC, when it comes to CSAM, child sexual abuse materials. These are no terrorism financing. These are treated with the highest level of you report, you freeze, you seize, you do what you have to do as you would in traditional finance. And I think businesses at this point they get that. I did want to address our colleague from Nigeria, welcome to Washington, and also to mention that I've spent a lot of time examining e-Naira. Nigeria is the first to have adopted a central bank digital currency, to have adopted a central bank digital currency, and that's had implications, a lot of resistance too, where crypto is banned because a control over e-Naira offers monetary oversight and visibility and controls by the government singularly, and that has implications in the context of Nigeria. I agree on the mutual evaluation report. There's a lot of discussion that can go there, specifically that the methodology does not apply to cash-intensive economies, and I've been kind of saying this since the 1990s.
So just to try to answer a few of these questions in one, the sanction evasion, that's hard. That's really, again, going back to the public-private and cooperation of what information can the government share, what is civil society, what can they share, so we can really, as all of us do, follow the money, see where there is sanction evasion, and then for the financial institutions to report it, either in voluntary self-disclosures or SARs, and then for the Justice Department and FinCEN to do their magic with that information that is provided to them. And then just to touch on what Brad had said, the government has to make choices, and with respect to not having Visa or MasterCard access in Russia, that's the same thing where there's a risk-based decision, and those are risk-based decisions to shut down those services. And with respect to multilateral, I think that it has to be cooperation. You've seen so much cooperation with the oil price cap, the G7, the US, the UK, that the multilateral, there have to be conversations for sanctions to work. They have to be multilateral, not unilateral. And with respect to the accountability, and I'm a sanctions nerd, I said that, the whole purpose of sanctions is to change behavior. If the purpose of sanctions is to seize assets and then turn them over to victims, where's the motivation to change the behavior? Because you're not going to get your assets back. So I point you to the Congress, because they have laws in place where you can attach blocked assets or assets of terrorist parties, so of Iran, state sponsors of terrorism. But there are flaws with that system. You see it being abused. And you also see that whoever's first in line gets the assets. And that's not, of course, in my mind, fair that just because you run faster than somebody else that you're going to get the prize. But I point you to the Congress to fix that.
I know we're really late, so I'll just say two things. And first of all, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this panel. On sanctions evasion and enforcement, and also the question on sort of assets and how you sort of stay at and actually make sure that there's collection once there's judgments or once there's actions. I think both of those things get to, again, the heart of what this panel is, which is just persistence and sustained and actual collection, right? We have already, I've seen again, being back in government, a lot of people come to us all the time and say, we know this is happening, or we know this guy is here. And sadly, that's not enough, right? We know this sanctions evasion is happening through Central Asia, through this part of sub-Saharan Africa. We know this guy who a judgment has been obtained against is here. And I think that's where more partnership and more collaboration, more information exchange is essential, because yes, it is urgent that there be real accountability that goes all the way through to consequences. Sadly, our system, I will say, the government, if there's one criticism I will be open about it, is we are very focused on like what we're doing now, right? There is, and you can make your criticisms about the world we live in, but there is a very significant focus on the attention of what actions are we taking this week on this thing, and not the sustained multi-year effort that's needed to address this problem and this consequence. And when it happens, when those things do happen, we're always very happy with them, but it's hard. The resources are focused on what the next threat is, what the next risk is, what the next action is, and less on ensuring that the action we've already taken is sufficiently enforced and implemented. And so I think that's where cooperation and resources are necessary. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much to these wonderful panelists, and thank you all for waking up early and staying late. So very much a dedicated audience. Thank you so much for coming.